right, now working memory. Hopefully, by the time I get done describing this, you'll understand the difference between working memory and short term memory, and maybe the problem with just sort of lumping them together and calling them one term. Let's see if I can make a good case. All right, so the characteristics of working memory. First off, capacity. Remember, we talked about the short term memory having seven plus or minus two individual items. Working memory is thought to be limited, but there's no definition on what limited means. What do you mean? Is it seven plus or minus two? Is it 100? What are you talking about? What do you mean by limited? And there's no clear definition on what constitutes a limited capacity on the short term memory. The duration, Badley and Hitch argue that the working memory system deals with transient material, things that you're not going to remember over the long, long term. But what do you mean by transient? 48 hours? 28 days? A year? Like, what do you mean by transient? I've read, my dissertation was on memory, and I've read all of the, like, I was trying to figure out basically for students kind of retention of material, what would constitute a long enough delay that I should have gotten outside the span of working memory? Like, I want to get into like true long-term memory. Like, how much of this content are you actually going to remember over the long term? And so I was doing research on how long of a delay should I have, right? And some researchers say just more than 30 seconds. And I thought, well, I'm not satisfied with that. I know a lot of things for 30 seconds that I don't know for 30 days, that's for sure. So I thought, well, okay, 30 seconds is going to be too short. Other researchers said 24 hours. Others said if you can get outside of 48 hours, you are certainly outside the span of working memory. Others said if you can get outside of 4 weeks, you are certainly outside the span of working memory. Okay, that's a pretty big range. 30 seconds to 28 days, like that's a pretty big range. It seems to me like a well-defined system should be well-defined, right? Like, what do you mean by working memory? Now, I'm going to give you some examples where working memory makes a lot of sense. Think of a time if you've ever stayed at a hotel for more than, especially for more than one night, or where you left the room and came back. During that stay, certainly you knew what room you were staying in, right? You didn't didn't encode the number, but you could find the door. You knew where you were, right? You knew where you belonged. Now that you're thinking back on it, try and generate that room number. Try and generate exactly what the turning sequence was to get you to that door. Try and do it. I'm doing it right now. I just went to a conference in 4 months ago, and it had a pretty unique design to the hotel that caused us to take some pretty weird turns to get down there. And I can visualize parts of it. I think there I think there's something in the middle I'm not remembering, and I certainly cannot even tell you what floor I was on, let alone what room number I was in. And I knew all those things at the time for the 3 days I was staying there. And I knew them without even thinking about it. I knew what button to push on the elevator to get to the floor I needed. I knew whether to turn right or left when I got out of the elevator. I knew, right? You know those things at the time and while they're active and while you're using it. That makes a lot of sense for working memory. Another thing that they point to with working memory is, knowing where you parked your car, right? Especially someplace that you go every single day, like maybe to school or to work or something like that. You park, usually you don't get to have the same spot every day. You might try for it. Like when I go to school, I try to get roughly the same spot every day so that I, lighten my working memory's load. I just go to the same spot every day. That's not always possible. If you arrive even 5 minutes late, somebody might have taken your chosen spot. So you need to find a spot nearby or whatever. Now it starts getting really super confusing because I know it's somewhere in this area. I know it's somewhere over here, right? But generally, you have a pretty good idea today where you left your car. And you pretty unfailingly will go back to it. What's really distressing is those times when that doesn't work, right? Where you get interference from previous day's parking, or this parking lot sure does look a lot like another parking lot that you've parked in. And so now you're like, oh, wait, where did I park? Generally, I mean, the reason why that's so noticeable is that generally that doesn't happen. Generally, you can keep track of where you've left your car on this day. These are good examples of what we would call working memory. Back when I was working my way through college, I was a waitress, and for a particular group in a particular seating area, booth or whatever, I could have a really good memory of what each individual person at the table ordered. I was one of those waitresses who didn't have to come up to the table and go, okay, who had the hamburger? I would come up and just start doling it out because I knew who had what, right? Because I had that kind of like spatial awareness of the table. Even if they got up and left and went to the bathroom, came back and sat in a different order, I usually had some kind of mnemonic that allowed me to recognize where they were sitting. But then they'd get up, they'd leave, a new party would take their spot, and I would just wipe out that recollection of what food went where and have a new table, right? I could address it as a brand new thing, even though I had just been serving this table with different people and different orders in it. That's one of the functions of working memory, is that ability to sort of switch on the fly. I can retain it as long as it's relevant and then clear when it's not. That's the important function of working memory. And I think that's where sometimes our parking lot problem comes in, is that sometimes we forget which one we're supposed to be wiping. Was that position I'm wiping, was that yesterday's position or is that today's? I'm so confused. Sometimes it fails. But as long as it's relevant, as long as it's active, it should be in working memory according to this model. I don't know if you'll remember it for 48 hours or 28 days. I don't know. But I can say what you're thinking about. Oh, I got a bad animation. Sorry about that. So let's talk a little bit about what the working memory is made up of. It has subsystems according to the model. So in this model, you have the visuospatial sketchpad, which handles all those kinds of visual tasks, anything spatial, kind of like the Brooks example I gave you where you're imagining outlining an X, those kinds of things, that's handled in the visuospatial sketchpad. Your knowledge of where to turn left and where to turn right to get to your classroom, or those kinds of things. That's all handled in the visuospatial sketchpad. The phonological loop handles all of your verbal things. So this is going to be anything that involves words. It could even be sub-vocalization, so things that you're just thinking inside of your head, but it's verbal. You can have simultaneous visuospatial sketchpad activities and phonological loop activities. Those things can be happening simultaneously without a huge degradation of efficiency, right? So you can be tracking for the sound of an alarm while also reading a book, right? Like you can handle both of these things simultaneously. Now, where it gets complicated is if you're trying to do two things that the visuospatial sketchpad is supposed to be handling, or two things that the phonological loop is supposed to be handling. That's where you start to get into, an overburdened, probably can't really do it kind of circumstance. So competition in the same modality is going to interfere with processing. And we already talked about this with attention. So this is sounding a little bit familiar, and you're going to see why it's sounding a little bit familiar as we go on. All right, now in the middle is this central executive. This is not a very well defined thing in Badley and Hitch's model. It's not. What is this central executive? Well, they say it's what decides how to deploy resources. They say it is an example of high level cognition. So it's more than just the visuospatial sketchpad or the phonological loop. It's higher level than that. It's what contains your episodic buffer, which is what they refer to when you are holding information for possible further processing. I'm trying to not say short-term memory, right? Because it sure sounds like the episodic buffer sure sounds like a short-term memory store, but that's okay. That's okay. The little overlap never hurts anybody. So this is the basic design. You have this central executive. Some people have criticized, I shouldn't be jumping to criticisms yet, but some people have said, what drives the central executive? Is there a little homunculus, which is a like little person inside your head that's controlling your central executive? Like, what is this? It's not well defined. So how you decide where to place your emphasis, if you have two tasks that are competing in the phonological loop, how does the central executive decide which one to process first or to ignore? Like, how does it decide that? That it's not clearly defined. Now, in support of the of the working memory model, brain activity does support the idea that there might be different systems. Here we have on the top panel somebody doing a verbal memory task, and on the bottom panel we see them doing a spatial memory task. And the verbal memory task, of course, is being controlled by the articulatory loop. And you see areas that are typically associated with language production anyway being activated by verbal memory tasks. The part of the brain that's used for, perceiving, verbal things, auditory things tends to be activated anyway. So it looks like, there's a verbal memory area, and then the spatial area, you can kind of the spatial tasks, you can kind of see different areas of the brain that are largely separate. There's a little overlap in that left hemisphere in the middle where you see superior, that column. You see a little of that, a little bit of activity on the left hemisphere for the spatial memory that overlaps the kind of activity that we're seeing very pronounced in the verbal memory. So there's a little overlap, right? There's some shared, but you see a lot of the spatial memory is happening on the right hand side of the brain, and a lot of the verbal memory is happening on the left. So it kind of gives some support for the idea that there might be different loops and that they're independent of each other. All right, I think I've been talking for a while, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and we'll come back and we'll do an example of working memory capacity.